Okay, so I'm going to give a fairly quick sample of some of the threads, a couple of the threads in the book Form Follows Fiction. I'm not going to try to cover everything that's included in the publication, but just talk about, follow a couple of threads that run through the project. I wanted to begin by showing a couple of photographs that I've taken in Toronto. So in 2017, so just about 3 years ago, I was watching this woman in Alexandra Park near Dundas and Bathurst tending to this community garden. And I was watching her work and watching her cultivate this narrow strip of earth in the middle of the city and creating a vibrant environment within this garden. So I photographed her at work. And I went back to this place earlier this summer, and this is what the place looks like today. So the row of townhouses that was facing her garden have been demolished, as has her garden. And right now, Alexandra Park is undergoing a huge process of what's called revitalization, which actually is a means of transforming affordable public housing into mixed use. So subsidized rent geared to income housing mixed with for-profit housing. And this dynamic, this transition from this to this in the space of 3 short years motivated some of what drove me to begin research on this publication. So this was the entrance to the exhibition at the Art Museum at the University of Toronto, Form Follows Fiction. And I was very interested to begin the exhibition with a series of what I took to be landscape works. And this is one such work that I'm referring to. So this is Robert Hoole's Premises for Self-Rule, made in 1994. And it's a series of 5 works. And I felt very proud that we were able to show 4 of the series of 5 in one room at the same time, because together they do constellate a kind of landscape. Each of these works, which consists of a painted monochrome panel, set side by side with a text and another panel that has been photosensitized to capture a photographic image from the historical archive. Each of these pairings refers to a specific piece of legislation. So the first piece refers to the Royal Proclamation of 1763 that established the British administration of North American territories, which were relinquished from France to Great Britain following the 7 Years' War. And crucially, the Royal Proclamation recognized that all other land in North America is indigenous territory. And it cannot be occupied by settlers, and it certainly cannot be stolen by settlers. It can only be ceded by treaty to the Crown. The second piece in this series of Robert Hoole's work, which you see on the left in this image with the bright red panel, refers to the British North America Act of 1867. So it's a British piece of legislation that created the Dominion of Canada. The center work in this image refers to the Indian Act of 1876. And it's a Canadian piece of federal law that governs in matters pertaining to Indian status, that is to say the designation of indigenous identity, Indian bands, so the form of governance imposed on indigenous communities, and Indian reserves, that is to say the demarcation of the land base of indigenous peoples. A very intense and hugely damaging piece of legislation. And on the right, we have the Constitution Act of 1982 that patriated the Canadian Constitution, and after much activism and struggles on the part of Indigenous communities, also ended up affirming Aboriginal rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So this is what I mean by conceiving of Robert Hoole's work in the exhibition as a kind of landscape. It does not look like a typical kind of geographical landscape painting or something like that, but it is a landscape, a kind of panorama of the legislative framework that shapes the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. Exhibited alongside this work was another multi-panel work by Carol Conde and Carl Beveridge. It's a series of photographs that shows another panorama. In each photograph, there's always a woman at work, at home. So on the top left, we have the moment represented is 1979, and it shows a South Asian woman holding a photograph of unionized women. And on the window, we see a view of women celebrating the independence of Zimbabwe. On the bottom left, the image refers to 1989, and it refers to the fall of the Berlin Wall. You can see someone with a sledgehammer taking down this wall that divided the city of Berlin. On the top right, we have the moment of 1999, which depicts an Asian Canadian videographer, and the magazines on her table refer to the AIDS epidemic and the rise of conservative family values. And on the bottom right, we have women working at home with a view out the window depicting the invasion of Iraq, and the magazines on the table refer to the moment of triumph of neoliberalism in the 2000s. The entire series begins with this piece on the right, which is set in 1895. The clue is the calendar on the wall that refers to Confederation life. So we know it must have taken place, this image must have taken place after the Constitution Act that we saw in Robert Hoole's work. And I interpret the woman because of her hair and the fact that she's working with blueberries. I imagine that she's an Indigenous woman in 1895, looking out towards us, the viewer. While on the window, there's images of British colonies in India, this intense photograph of people serving almost as human horses or something like that to sustain the system of exploitation that colonization and imperialism represents. In the book, this work of Carol Conde and Carl Beveridge is paired with this photograph on the left by Jeff Thomas, titled Dreamscape Streetcar Dundas Street from 1987. And it depicts the artist's son, Bear, in the streetcar, so in one of the TTC streetcars on Dundas Street. Bear is wearing a baseball cap on his head, and on the baseball cap, you see this embroidered tree of peace, which refers to the 6 nations of the Grand River. So we read him in reference to the 6 nations, Haudenosaunee people living in this province. And as Bear is looking out the window and passing through Dundas Street, we see Chinese businesses in Toronto's Chinatown. And so this, both of these images set up a relationship between what's happening from the point of view of 2 different Indigenous people in relation to the view out the window and the transformations and the consistencies that are happening through historical events. Later on in the publication, In Form Follows Fiction, we see this pairing. So on the left, we have the 1805 version of the Toronto Purchase, so Treaty 13, that marked the land treaty that established what is now the city of Toronto. And this is paired on the right with Gordon Lebrett's work, Get Hold of This Space, from 1974. The Toronto Purchase document is fascinating because it depicts the entire territory. And I imagine the person who drew up this image was quite familiar with the landscape, the geography, the ecosystem, the people, the economies, the cultures that he saw all around him in this territory. And yet all of that complexity and richness is depicted as an empty rectangle on this page. And I was very interested to imagine what it takes to, on the one hand, experience a rich complexity in your environment, but to choose to represent it in the form of a blank, empty rectangle in this document. I think this is something that Gordon Lebret is asking us to consider. The image of this empty rectangle reappears in Gordon Lebret's work. And this abstract geometry is cast under the light of a gesture and an ideology of getting hold of space. So the abstract geometry is now connected to an ideology of seizure, of getting hold of something. And this theme is developed later in the exhibition with these two works. So on the left, General Ideas letterhead, which took the form of a blank architectural blueprint. So this is the letterhead that they would write letters, their business letters to people, which they designed as this blank rectangle of sorts, but it's been filled in with a grid, this architectural grid to help the architect design the plans. And this is paired in the catalog with John Collins' plan for the Harbor of Toronto with the proposed town and settlement of 1788. So very soon after the original Toronto Purchase. Now we see the grid similarly be superimposed on the empty rectangle. What in the publication I refer to as the mythological figure of the vacant lot. The operation of the vacant lot is rendered in striking detail in these two drawings by David William Smith, plans for the enlargement of York in 1797. On the left, we have the actual blocks that were being built in the town of York. So you see these 10 or 12 pink squares, which are considered to be the original blocks of the city that, in the neighborhood of what is now St. Lawrence Market. And on the right, we have an almost identical rendition of the first drawing, but this time inside each of the blank squares, you see people writing their names inside each square. So people are writing their family names inside the squares. And this gesture of settlement and colonial settlement as people get hold of this space, so to speak, makes very palpable and very real the slow and gradual process of this ideology of seizure, of colonial seizure, manifesting in the presence of these two documents. So the exhibition was thinking a lot about this mythological image of the vacant lot and what it implies. And it did so from very different angles. This work by Robert Wiens, I think, in some sense, problematizes this notion of the blank rectangle, the vacant lot. Robert Wiens' piece takes the form of an architectural model. So maybe in reference to the general idea letterhead, the image of the architect recurs in this artwork as well. And if we look inside the model, we see what appears to be an empty cinema. So we're inside of a cinema, and there's a luminous projection. So either the movie has ended and we see the blank screen, or it has not yet begun. In either case, we see this empty rectangle recur. And a text that's attached on the wall that is part of the piece shifts some of the meanings of this empty rectangle. I'll read out the text that's part of this work. It says, "The rip was small when it first appeared. It began when an Indian poked a knife through the screen. Later, a bottle was thrown through it. The rip continued to grow. Eventually, it became impossible to ignore. And so this short narrative, once we return to seeing this empty rectangle, we start to imagine the rip that is present not so much in the screen before our eyes, but it becomes present in our mind's eye. That this vacant lot is not in fact so vacant, and its apparent vacancy hides something, a rupture, a fracture, a rip, an act of protest on the part of the Indian who poked a knife through the screen, and later the person who threw a bottle through it, so that the rip that is hidden behind the apparent emptiness of the vacant lot is in itself impossible to ignore. So some of these artworks problematized this idea of what I've been calling this mythology of the vacant lot. There's another mythological image that became an important theme in the publication and in the exhibition. On the one hand, we have the vacant lot. On the other hand, we have the image of the tangled garden. And these two works by the Toronto Ink Company and John Sasaki serve to illustrate some of these ideas about what I mean by this idea of the tangled garden. So on the left, we have this work by the Toronto Ink Company, who's an artist who forages around the city of Toronto and collects organic material, so plants, roots, bark, and inorganic material, rust, bits of stone, dirt, brick, and takes this material found from the city and distills it to create these, to create inks and pigments that he then uses to create these abstract paintings that are themselves made out of the very material that the city is composed of. And on the right, we have this series of 3 photographs by John Sasaki. There are 3 photographs of Petri dishes in which are growing a complex ecosystem of microbes, bacteria, funguses, who knows. So the artist visited the museum, at the McMichael Museum's collection, in which are housed 3 of the painters' palettes used by a group of 7 painters. So they have the palettes used by Tom Thomson, A.J. Casson, and Friedrich Varley. And John Sasaki took swabbings from the surface of these palettes and cultivated the microbes that got picked up through these swabbings and photographed these cultures taking place inside of the Petri dish. So I think of these living cultures, these abstract paintings created out of the very material that the city is made of, as a very different perspective, different from this idea of the world around me as empty. Rather, in these works, the world around us is full of rich material, rich life forms that might be difficult to discern, but we can pay attention to them if we look closely enough, or if we know how to attend to these things around us. Here's a couple of other images of the Tangled Garden. This painting by Parashkeva Clark titled Swamp from 1939. I love the idea of Parashkeva in the late 1930s in Toronto, going to a swamp to make a painting. Swamp tends not to be often thought of as a glorious subject for landscape painting, but I'm very intrigued by what motivated Parashkeva Clark to pay attention to a swamp and the complexity and the mirror reflections that happen inside it. On the right, we have a detailed drawing by Olia Mischenko, who creates these little, I think of them as like Fraggle Rock or like little munchkin cultures of people creating this anarchic architecture. Here on the left is another image from this series of Olia Mischenko, these little miniature people creatures. They're almost like insects who are creating these improvised architectures around them. And this drawing is paired with Lisa Steele's video from 1973 titled Earthworms, where she pays attention to the life forms that are growing just underneath the surface of things. So the worms that sustain the environment invisibly under the surface of what's visible. The idea of the tangled garden takes on a new meaning in these works. This work by Deanna Bowen, The Sum of the Parts, What Can't Be Named, from 2010, on the left, and on the right, Greg Kernow's drawing, List of Names of Boys I Grew Up With, from 1962. In these cases, the tangled garden becomes a kind of family tree. So the metaphor of the family tree and of relationships between people and affiliations between people becomes part of this image of the tangled garden. So Deanna Bowen, it's a very powerful video. She narrates the history that she's able to research of her family tree, and stories of enslavement, of hard work, of liberation, of settlement, of forced resettlement, as she traces her family moving from the southern United States and eventually making their way into Canada. Deanna now lives in Toronto. So it's a powerful depiction of the relationships, the struggles, the attempts at exploitation, and the effort of resistance that it holds together the branches of the family tree to keep it alive. And on the right, we have this drawing by Greg Kernow where he remembers, in his memory, he thinks of the names of the boys he grew up with and tries to render them letter by letter with these rubber stamps. And it becomes a kind of family tree as well. They're not boys he's necessarily related to by birth in a family relationship, but by reference to this memory, they become part of his imaginary family, his kind of cosmology of relationships growing up. These photographs on the left by Arnaud Mag, it's a series of portraits of different individuals. Here is represented Jane Jacobs, the activist and writer of urbanism, as well as Northrop Frye, the literary critic, who's both of whom are quite influential in the way that they've, in some sense, informed the way that I understand Toronto. And on the right, we have Arthur Wenwick's series of photographs titled Masks, Artists and Curators. Another kind of portrait that creates another kind of family tree. So Arthur Wenwick photographed artists and curators who were participating in the Indigenous Curatorial Conference in Vancouver. And he asked people to sit in front of his camera for the portraits. And he asked them to think of their relationships, to think of a kind of totem or clan relationships, and to project their sense of identity through their face, through their intention towards the camera. So very interesting ways to think of the family tree. In one case, the professional networks that Indigenous artists and curators are forming across Turtle Island and creating new networks and new relationships to sustain an Indigenous artistic practice. So you can see this idea of the family tree taking different forms in the exhibition. On the work on the left by Surinder Dhaliwal, Punjabi Sheets, Family Tree of 1989, we see the English language and the Punjabi language mixed together to narrate the relationships of members within a family. And on the right, we have Susie Lake's series of works, Are You Talking to Me?, where she's mimicking the role of the main character in Taxi Driver when he has that famous scene in his bathroom looking at his reflection in the mirror and saying, are you talking to me? Are you talking to me? And both of these works, I think, raise the question of who are we talking to, and what language can we use? Sometimes we can take a language for granted, but not an interlocutor for granted, in the case of Susie Lake. On the case of Surinder Dhaliwal, we can take our interlocutors for granted, but we can't always take for granted the fact that we can speak the same language, or that the translation works perfectly from one language to another. Many self-portraits also feature in the exhibition and in the publication. On the left, we have this work by Carl Bean, Self-Portrait in My Christian Dior Bathing Suit. An amazing work of art, a watercolor self-portrait of the artist standing in this very centered pose, wearing a Christian Dior bathing suit. When I'm thinking about the word Christian in the name Christian Dior, and that makes me think about the history of Christian missionaries in the process of colonizing North America. And when I was speaking to Bonnie Devine about this work, she noticed that the clean, elegant, minimalist geometry of the bathing suit contrasts sharply with the untamed, as she called it, shape of Carl Bean's hair and beard. And in that sense, his hair and his beard seems to represent what could not have been tamed, what could not have been ordered or regimented or regulated by the practices of the missionary work. On the right, we have Joanne Todd's painting, The Magic of Sao Paulo, where she and fellow artist Elizabeth Mackenzie are dressed for the ball. So they're depicted as if they were attending the gala reception for the Sao Paulo Biennial in 1985. Of course, neither of them was invited to the Sao Paulo Biennial, but here they are in the painting as if they were. Joanne Todd was not featured on the cover of C magazine, but in the painting, she paints herself into the picture as if she was on the cover and she was at the gala reception of this international biennial. So a very interesting ideas of portraiture and self-portraiture in creating new possibilities. Ken Monkman's work, The Emergence of a Legend from 2006, features the artist in his alter ego named Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, and who is at once a model or an actress, but crucially, she's also the film director. She's the one calling the shots. And on the right, we have this work by David Buchan, where the artist is putting on, posing, and taking off, and trying on new outfits, new signifiers for masculinity that were available in 1981. And he pairs these fashion codified signifiers of different options for masculinity to different addresses in the city of Toronto. And so he's creating a kind of geography through the manipulating or playing with the codes of gendered identity in the city. I'm gonna end by referring to Wanda Nanibush's exhibition, Toronto Tributes and Tributaries, at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And I remember on the exhibition panel, she observed, this city tends to bury things, histories, neighborhoods, waterways. And this idea of burying makes me think of the vacant lot in relation to the Tangled Garden once again. She invited me to do a panel discussion with her at the AGO. And I remember showing this image from Instagram that Dwayne Linklater took while visiting the Form Follows Fiction exhibition. So Dwayne is photographing the Toronto Purchase document. And I remember remarking about this image. And I said, I find it very interesting that Dwayne inverted the signification of the vacant lot. In this case, it's become a mirror. So you see the artist's image reflected on the glass that's framing this historical document. And I continue by saying, when Wanda and I earlier talked about artists who complicate the picture, I find it fascinating how in this case, in Dwayne's case, one can take a metaphor, the metaphor of the vacant lot, and invert it, switch it, do something else with it. And Wanda said, this image of himself imposed on the vacant lot is very much like Bear against the wall in the Toronto cityscape of Jeff Thomas's photograph, Cultural Revolution. It's creating presence that is actually present. It's actually there. It's just you can't see it. What you're saying, she said to me, is that the vacant lot is not really vacant. And I said, yes, it's a fiction. And she said, nothing is really buried, it's all there. So why don't we deal with what's here instead of keeping talking about what's absent, as if it really is absent. It's not, it's right here. We just can't see it in the way that we need to. So I'll end with two photographs from the apartment where I live. So this is the fire escape in the apartment that I share with Chris Carreri on Roncesvalles Avenue. And this is in 2017. One of our neighbors had decorated our fire escape with these stickers of butterflies and these plastic flowers and this patterned cloth and this velvet painting. And 1 year later, in 2018, this is what it looked like. So the building was bought by a new owner, and the new owners desired to have this as an improvement from this. There's still traces of the original arrangement from just a year before. So there's a few photographs, a few stickers of the butterflies still remain, but a sense of vibrancy has to be recalled through the work of memory in order to see this in this. And this is part of, I think, what curatorial practice is able to do, and what publishing practice is also able to connect us to, this dimension of the different realities that take place in the same environment.